Our natural world is our Visa card, and we are basically running up the debt. The gaps are huge in British Columbia. We do not have a dedicated species at risk law. We have some little patchwork quilt pieces of legislation, like BC's Wildlife Act. It was instigated in 1996. Do you know how many species are on there? Endangered species, 4.
I think it's, like 4.
4. Pelican, Vancouver Island marmot, sea otter. What's the last one? Burrowing owl.
Burrowing
4.
owl. Yeah.
4.
So that's out of 500 that
500 species that are endangered or threatened, and another 1,100 that are vulnerable or special concern. Species at Risk Act across Canada come into play when a province is not protecting species at risk. BC is not protecting species at risk. We don't have a standalone law. And as we've documented, our endangered species are continuing to be endangered and not get off that list. The decision-making powers over natural resources and the land base are provincial. And yet people think that we are protecting our species at risk because we have a federal law. I think we haven't really realized what has changed under our watch. But if you fly over British Columbia and look down, that's where you can really see the scale of what used to be old growth forest now gone. And inside those forests are all of the creatures that really depended on old growth.
Even when we look at the small number of genuine improvements, how many of those are actually the scenario we have in our minds where this extremely endangered species that's in the emergency room is cared for and nurtured and removed from the list? Is that even the picture in the small number of successes that we have?
Changes in temperature to streams in the interior of BC has drastic cascading impacts to Pacific salmon health on the coast, which then affects First Nations, which affects Southern residents, which affects all of these other ecosystem dynamics. That's why it's also super important to be engaging with these nations that have this knowledge of these ecosystems.
Saying that this a new project or a new development, new pipeline is going to, it's not going to increase noise any further. That shouldn't be the bar that we're going for, because what we need to be doing is decreasing noise. We need to be rapidly doing so, in fact.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today our podcast is on a recent report that looks at the changing status of imperiled species in BC over the last 15 years in the absence of a dedicated provincial species at risk law, and reveals that species at risk in BC have risen, with most changes in status not reflecting genuine recovery. We're also going to have a small chat at the end about the recent announcement by the Alberta government that they want to be the proponent of an oil pipeline to the west coast and what that might mean for BC. We went over time with today's episode because it was a great conversation, so I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves. But before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions, events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recommend another podcast to you. It's called Cited. Cited is about the politics of science and research. Their new season is called Green Dreams. Each episode tells the story of a utopian thinker and their dreams for a green future. You'll learn about prominent environmental theorists across the ideological spectrum, and about some lesser-known figures that operate in the shadows. Should we make these green dreams a reality, or are they actually nightmares? Catch Green Dreams at citedpodcast.com. That's at CITED podcast.com. So, Sally, Peter, Brynna, thank you so much for joining me today. Just before we get going, who are you and what do you do?
My name is Sally Otto. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia. I've lived in this province for 30 years and I love it. I teach about evolution and biodiversity, and I also teach math to our students to help them connect the world and the patterns they see around us to fundamental processes.
And I'm Peter. Thank you. Thank you for having us. I'm a postdoctoral fellow, basically means a researcher with a PhD. So my full-time job is to do research. I work on a whole lot of things, but the questions that most interest me are often to do with how can we as humans be the best citizens possible in service of wildlife and of biodiversity, and what can we do differently to help preserve and protect wildlife. So those are the questions that most excite me. And similar to Sally, I like to bring in a mathematical angle. I enjoy working with big data sets and numbers and trying to leverage some of those skills to answer new questions that are really urgent and difficult.
And I'm Brynna Kagala-Visentin. I'm a campaigner for the Lands and Freshwater team for the BC chapter of the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society. We're one of the oldest conservation nonprofits in Canada, and we work to protect more lands and waters and habitat for wildlife across the province. And most namely, kind of the thing that I'm responsible for is increasing public engagement and awareness of the government's commitment to protect 30% of lands and waters by 2030. And that's a commitment made both at the provincial level and the federal level. And super happy to be here. Not the biggest fan of math and data, so happy that that's in your department. I'm definitely more on the emotional side and figuring out, how to get people to connect with nature emotionally, whether it's through art or creativity. So that's kind of my realm, and happy to be here.
On that note, both the emotional side and the mathematics side, I'm curious, you've got a new report out. It deals with species at risk, with biodiversity. Can you tell us a little bit about the project and what motivated you to take on the project and why it's important right now for BC?
BC is one of the most biodiverse provinces in the country. We have over 24,000 species that we know about, and there's even more that we don't know about in this province. And I, like most people who live in this province, we value nature. We are inspired when we go on hikes and see the beauty of this province. They call it beautiful BC for a good reason. But I think many of the people who live here don't actually realize that there's no protections in place for species at risk, imperiled species in our province. And I think that's a big disconnect. There was a CPAW study in 2023 that pointed out that over 80% of the public believes in the importance of protecting biodiversity and aims to improve those protections. So there's a mismatch. What's going on that we value the natural world so much, and yet we have very little legal protections for species at risk? So this project was aiming to see, well, maybe. So there's a federal law. It's called the Species at Risk Act, and it applies on federal lands and in waters. But federal lands in BC, that's only 1% of the province. So that means 99% of the province lacks a dedicated species at risk law to protect species. But maybe we're doing okay without laws. We can do well with regulations, we can do well with policy, so maybe we're doing fine anyway. And so that really motivated this study. How are we doing? How have the number of species at risk, the imperiled, endangered species in our province, how have they been faring over the last 15 years?
I guess I can also say that similarly to Sally, I really value biodiversity here in BC. I spend as much time as I can outside. I'm also a little bit of a bird watcher. And so the diversity of all living things in this province and in the lands and waters where I am so fortunate to live is something I really care about. And like Sally said, the Species at Risk Act is a wonderful initiative, a really amazing effort to protect wildlife in Canada, but it does have its limitations in that it only applies to federal land and water. So we have so much of this beautiful province here that is not covered by the Species at Risk Act. And to our knowledge, there's no existing sort of census or monitoring across the entire diversity of species in BC with respect to how these species are doing. And we do know that the data that would be necessary to generate such a study does exist, thanks to a lot of hard work that the provincial government has put into maintaining this really impressive BC Conservation Data Center. And this is a huge repository of every species that has been tracked, over 20,000 species that have been tracked and assessed and included in this huge database with information about the status of that species and information about how vulnerable those species are to extinction. If, in theory, one was able to take that data and compare it to historical versions of the repository, you would then be able to potentially draw a really concrete and exhaustive picture of how are things changing, at least over the past, say, 10 to 20 years, in terms of overall, what is biodiversity doing in British Columbia?
Yeah, and it's interesting you both note the way in which BC has an effect on how we view nature. I mean, like, I have lots of family in BC. I've been there quite a bit over my life. It always feels like nature on a grand scale, on a sort of scale that is unique. The size of the mountains, the diversity too of landscapes. I mean, you have desert, you have rainforest, you have all these interesting microclimates within BC. I'm curious, what biodiversity trends have we seen or have you seen in BC over the past few decades?
What one would want is that the number of imperiled species that goes down, that we know that they're imperiled. We do what we need to do to protect them. And so we see fewer of them. And we saw the opposite. There's 16% more species at risk in this province than there was in 2008. And that represents 1,600 known species at risk at present. So that was the bad news, is that there's more species at risk. We dug in a little bit more to see, too, why were they changing? Why were species being added to the most imperiled list, which is called red listed in BC? That means they're endangered or threatened species. And unfortunately, more often when a species got added to the red list, it was for real reasons. Their habitat had declined, the threats to those species had increased. Whereas there were a lot of times where things seemed to get better, especially for plants. There was a time when it was like 1,000 species seemed to get better. They went from the red list to the blue list. Blue list is vulnerable, special concern, but not at that highly imperiled red classification. But almost all of those changes were non-genuine. Scientists had more information, or we used new methodology, or we discovered a population we didn't know about before. So that's not that the species actually got any better off. It's that we changed how we ranked it.
I'll try and provide some examples, because this genuine versus non-genuine thing, this was one of the most difficult parts of the study for us, was determining what species are genuine changes and what species have, at least there's not evidence to suggest that they have genuinely changed. So when we're thinking about a genuine change, we want to determine what is happening to biodiversity on the ground in BC. And so an example of a genuine change would be a species of bird that the population is declining rapidly and continues to decline. And so that would be a very high level of risk. And 10 years later, we go and we do a survey of this bird, and we're seeing now that the populations are starting to stabilize or even increase, or maybe the range is expanding. We looked for this bird in Creston, BC 10 years ago, and we didn't find any, and now it's there. And maybe we would conclude now, we can say, okay, maybe things are working for this bird. We've potentially implemented some conservation legislation, or we've implemented some regulations that are helping this bird. We're going to say it's now blue listed, which, as Sally mentioned, is still considered at risk, but it's a lower level of risk of extinction. So that would be a genuine improvement, or as we call it in our study, a downlisting. It's going down from red to blue. An example of a non-genuine downlisting would be, let's say there's this dragonfly. And of course, dragonflies are very small. It's hard to know where dragonflies are. We don't know a lot about them. Let's say 10 years ago, the only thing we knew about this dragonfly is that there is this one little river valley somewhere in the far southeastern of BC, East Kootenays, where this dragonfly has been seen. And it's a very rare dragonfly in this river valley. In that situation, you would give that a red listing. It's very small population, very vulnerable to being extinct from BC or extirpated from BC. Let's say in the time between assessments, so let's say after that conclusion of red listing, we were doing some surveys up in the Peace River region, and suddenly we found tons of these dragonflies all over the place. They appear to be very common. It's quite clear that this does not represent a population expansion so much as it represents new information. So we just didn't look there. We didn't look for this dragonfly. We'd never looked there before. but it turns out it was there, and it's quite possible that it's been there the whole time. So certainly with knowledge of this new giant population along the Peace River in northeastern BC, we would conclude maybe to downlist from red to blue because it represents now the population is not as threatened. And that's a great story too. It's great that we're doing more monitoring and finding these species in places where we didn't think they were. That's really important work. And it's also great to know that we thought this species was really, really rare in BC, and now we know it's maybe not so rare. That's also a good story. But ultimately, that non-genuine change, it doesn't tell us about what has happened to that dragonfly population in the last 10 years, because presumably it was already present in this new population. So by isolating the genuine changes and kind of peeling back the layers of non-genuine changes, we can really start to see what is actually happening to biodiversity in BC on this large scale. And when we peel back the hundreds of non-genuine changes and isolate the relatively few genuine changes in either direction, we find that the most common outcome for species in BC is no change, is that they remain red-listed species, remain red-listed, blue-listed species remain blue-listed, and so on. By far, the most common outcome is that things are staying the same. And once again, that can be thought of as a good story, but it also means that these species that we knew were at risk 10 years ago are still in trouble, and we are not doing enough to actually downlist them and take them off the list. So I would say, and Sally's welcome to comment, but that's the biggest takeaway for me, is that when you go in and peel back these non-genuine changes, the most common outcome is that things are staying relatively the same as they were.
I think I want to quickly ask a question that you said that things are staying the same, but for example, for southern resident killer whales, right? They're red listed, but things we do know are getting worse. Like we are seeing decreasing Pacific salmon returns and runs. We are seeing no improvements in maybe noise traffic. We're seeing increased, shipper traffic as well. So can you maybe just clarify? Because maybe some people might think, oh, so, species could be red listed, but they're not getting worse. They're kind of staying the same. But we do know that for a lot of populations that are at risk, things are getting worse, including for Pacific salmon, including southern mountain caribou as well.
Yeah, I guess I'll quickly say, of course, if you're red listed, the only way to get worse in terms of the listing is to go extinct. Southern resident killer whales, for example, is an example where we have a lot of information on their populations, and their populations are slowly declining, and they continue to decline. So the fact that 20 years ago, we had 90 southern resident killer whales. I'm just roughly guessing. And now we have 73 or 74. That trend is continuing, and we haven't really done enough, you could argue, to address that. So the fact that those list statuses are not changing, that doesn't I don't mean to say that the population is staying the same. It means the level of threat and the level of risk of extinction is in the same general group. And of course, if you have a species that's already red listed, it can't get any worse. That's the highest quality, the highest category of risk.
I think we need to emphasize that being on the red list means that these species are in the emergency room. Their populations have declined. They're at threat. We really risk losing them from this province. The fact that we have almost 500 species on the red list, 500 species, and they're not protected, means we've got 500 species that we may well lose in our lifetime, within the foreseeable future. And we're not doing anything to get them out of the emergency room. They're stuck there.
Strikes me a little bit like seeing somebody teetering on the edge of a cliff and trying to balance themselves and then turning around and turning back and seeing them still trying to balance themselves and going, well, that's fine. And given the way, too, in every other way, the way our environmental situation seems to be going, which is that we're passing all these other thresholds, whether that's climate or biodiversity, if you have those 500 species on that line of extinction and all the other sort of things are pushing in the direction of them going extinct, having a consistent red listing strikes me as extremely dangerous. I'm curious about something else, because there's another tie in here that I see between this and some of the stuff I deal with in climate change, which is that, we'll have, for instance, a cold day during the summer, and somebody will point to that and say, well, that's an example that climate change isn't real. And do you find the same thing happens with this, where somebody didn't calculate this new species area, or there's a change in the data and people use that as some sort of reason to say, well, actually, there's not that much danger happening here? Or do you find the conversation hasn't quite gotten to that point yet with this?
I think there's two things. It's impossible to know the status of every species in BC because we simply are not monitoring. We can't, not across the whole province. So there's so much uncertainty. And it's hard to really push the government and the public to make real change to their lives, which is what we're calling for in order to protect the habitat necessary and to reverse climate change impacts, to ensure that biodiversity in British Columbia is protected and thrives into the future. That's one issue. The other issue, I think, is there's this phenomenon called shifting baselines, where what we expect of the natural world is what we've seen recently, and we are unaware of the changes that occurred over a larger time frame. We're unaware that when we look out at the Georgia Strait, there really aren't fish jumping in the sea. There aren't orcas jumping that there would have been had we lived 100 years ago. And this is where First Nations can really tell us our world is changing. We have to pay attention and act, even though our impressions right now is it's still beautiful BC, right? It's still a natural world when we look out there. But take a look outside, right? The window you're looking out, how many of the species that you're looking at are actually native British Columbian species that aren't, from the gardens from Europe that were imported? How many of the species that we're seeing are impacted by this massive change to the habitat around us?
Is BC actually at a bit of a disadvantage? Because I'm just thinking for people because I'm familiar with this as well. History, this shifting baseline syndrome, what you see and you expect as the natural world is actually not what it was 100 years ago. And again, BC has that aspect of nature that is very grand in scale, right? Like all places have these natural, beautiful aspects, but it's very grand. It has a sense of overwhelming size. Does that actually put that shifting baseline syndrome in BC at a disadvantage because people are just inherently so impressed by it, I guess?
Yeah, you've got a point that impressive feeling, and it is still awe-striking, makes us maybe a little blind to the changes that are occurring. And I think we haven't really realized what has changed under our watch. The massive change in forests across the province, the massive loss of old growth forests across the province. It's hard to see that, especially in our cities. It's hard to see exactly what fraction of trees have been lost. But if you fly over British Columbia and look down, that's where you can really see the scale of what used to be old growth forests now gone. And inside those forests are all of the creatures that really depended on old growth. It's since I started working here that we've really lost different populations of caribou that relied on that old growth forest, and they're now extinct. Those populations are now extinct, or the northern spotted owl gone from our forests. And so this isn't just on paper thing. This is our world changing, and it's under our watch, which makes it particularly heartbreaking.
And I'll just add another wrinkle into this, which is that many of the genuine improvements in listing are a result of climate change, specifically global warming, because in a fairly cool place at a high latitude like BC, there are lots of species for whom it is too cold, or at least for whom it was too cold even a few decades ago, and are now expanding northward into our province. And of course, given that represents a natural expansion that was not directly influenced by humans, emphasis on directly there, of course, those species are included in the Conservation Data Center. And some of those species went from formerly being red or blue in BC because they had very small populations in the province that were at the periphery of their global range to now being quite common. And there's a lot of information to suggest that they are increasing. Many insect species are subject to this. So, even we take the genuine increases, the genuine improvements that do exist, we have to contextualize those in context of why they're happening. They're not necessarily happening because people are intervening and restoring a fallen population. It's happening because of climate change itself. And I don't think I'm in a position ethically to say whether it's a good or bad thing that these species are doing what they're doing. But I think it's important to point out, even when we look at the small number of genuine improvements, how many of those are actually the scenario we have in our minds where this extremely endangered species that's in the emergency room is cared for and nurtured and removed from the list. Is that even the picture in the small number of successes that we have?
It's hard to blame the lobster for moving north, right?
Yeah.
I do wonder then, do you have species that maybe they're native to southern BC, but now they're invasive to northern BC, or is that sort of the situation that you're running into?
We don't tend to use the word invasive for range expansions. It's a good question. But yeah, we're seeing range expansions for many, many species. So plants, animals, insects, everything is moving north because the climate is clearly moving north. On average, it's about 1 kilometer a year of a shift northward in climate for species. And so the species either have to keep up with that 1 kilometer a year warming, or they face mismatching their environment and going extinct.
Which
So
doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a lot.
a kilometer, if you're a tree, you're not going to be walking. And, some of these species that we're talking about are teeny little insects. And so keeping up with a climate change that fast, 1 kilometer a year in BC, that's really hard.
And sometimes the range expansion of another species can represent a very key threat to another red-listed species that has been native to BC for a longer period of time. An example of that is barred owls, which are very close relatives of the northern spotted owl, which is now gone in BC. And the main reason that northern spotted owls are gone is because the old growth is gone. But it was also not helped by the fact that 100 years ago, there weren't any barred owls in BC. And now the generalist barred owl makes it harder for spotted owls to survive because they outcompete. And that's not a natural competitor for the spotted owl. So that's an additional factor where the barred owl naturally arrived in BC as a result of a range expansion. And that's a species that would have been red listed or not even on the list and is now, I would imagine, yellow because they're quite easy to find in their native range. And barred owls are a threat to spotted owls. And so it becomes quite a messy situation. And that's why, once again, I say it's difficult to know how to react to that sort of downlisting, that sort of genuine improvement.
Yeah, and I think all of this makes me think about, because the question of not putting a moral label of whether it's good or bad, that it does come down to, though, like, what is a healthy ecosystem and what does a healthy ecosystem look like? So if you are having these changes in habitat, whether it's through land use changes or the land is changing through climate change or other things like that, that's going to shift ecosystem dynamics, which then have like tons of ripple effects outward. Like, something I didn't really realize was how interconnected interior ecosystems, so meaning like further away from the coast, are, how interconnected they are for Pacific salmon, and that like changes in temperature to streams in the interior of BC has drastic cascading impacts to Pacific salmon health on the coast, which then affects First Nations, which affects southern residents, which affects all of these other ecosystem dynamics. And so that's why it's also super important to be engaging with these nations that have this knowledge of these ecosystems on their territory, and also to have that bridge, of, we always hear the Western science merging with traditional knowledge and Indigenous wisdom, but like that's why it's so critical, because you need to understand how these ecosystems function in terms of what is health, because as we know, community health and human well-being is so linked to ecosystem health. But the way that our like technological revolution or our technological advancements have gone is that we can kind of control the human health to a certain point with the failing health of ecosystems, but we can't do it forever, and it's not sustainable. But we live very insulated from that relationship with nature, just in terms of how our societies have developed.
And we don't put an economic price tag on nature. And I don't want to. But what that means is we can abuse it. We can basically, it's like, a Visa card. Our natural world is our Visa card, and we are basically running up the debt. That debt is going to come back to haunt our children and future generations. So we have to pay down our debt and really protect it's a reciprocity thing. If we do not live in a way that protects the nature around us, that's going to come back to haunt us.
BC doesn't have a standalone species at risk law. Why does that matter? And what gaps does it leave in protecting biodiversity?
The gaps are huge in British Columbia. We do not have a dedicated species at risk law. We have some little patchwork quilt pieces of legislation, like BC's Wildlife Act. It was instigated in 1996. Do you know how many species are on there? Endangered species, 4.
I think it's, like 4.
4. Pelican, Vancouver Island marmot, sea otter. What's the last one? Burrowing owl.
Burrowing
4.
owl. Yeah.
4.
So that's out of 500 that
500 species that are endangered or threatened, and another 1,100 that are vulnerable or special concern. So, and then the Forestry and Range Practices Act can avoid destruction of an area, but it's all can. There's not any must do regulations. So there's tools. There's another tool, which is the Species at Risk Act across Canada, come into play when a province is not protecting species at risk. BC is not protecting species at risk. We don't have a standalone law. And as we've documented, our endangered species are continuing to be endangered and not get off that list. Anyway, this SARA, the federal law, they can sweep in and they can say, you're not actually governing and protecting species at risk on these lands. We're going to do an emergency order and protect those lands. But that's a problematic thing to do in a country where provincial jurisdiction over land is so deep-seated and strong. To have the federal government sweep in, that would basically, I think, cause a shift in the balance of powers that wouldn't be tolerated.
Maybe I'll just quickly reiterate, too, just how important British Columbia is with respect to biodiversity. We mentioned it at the outset, but there are so many. It's one of the most biodiverse provinces in Canada. I think the Ontarians and the British Columbians can fight that one out, among others. And there are so many unique biogeographic features. I mean, of course, the Pacific Ocean. This is the only province that borders the Pacific Ocean. So all of these Pacific coastal species, the Pacific coastal rainforest, the waters itself, those are only found in BC. The Okanagan Valley is such an incredibly unique landscape in Canada. It's the closest thing Canada has to a desert. The Coast Mountains. I mean, I could go on. The Fraser River estuary in Delta. So we have all these really unique landscapes that have evolved all sorts of really unique species. And basically what I'm trying to say is British Columbia has an elevated responsibility to protect biodiversity and to be the standard in Canada for provincial biodiversity protection because of all these incredible, unique, and diverse species that help make the province what it is in terms of that image of natural beauty. And yet there's basically no provincial legislation, as Sally pointed out. So I think it's important to restate that.
There was a mandate letter in 2017 that Horgan mandated that Minister Heyman enact a species at risk legislation. And that mandate came and went. A couple of years ago, there was a biodiversity draft framework, not a species at risk law, but there was hope that maybe that larger biodiversity framework would protect the species that live in this province. But we haven't seen any legislative push on that. You know what? It feels like nature and the environment always takes a backseat. It takes a backseat under every government. And there's always some other higher priority. But what that means is that this core value that I think British Columbians share, no matter whether, what your job is and how you work and live in this province, you share a desire to protect the natural world. And yet it always takes a back seat because there's always going to be something more important. There always will be. And it's easier to make those immediate decisions about, well, we have to react to changes that are happening in the United States or changes to the job and labor market. And those are super important, but not to always trade that off against nature.
Yeah, and I also think that fundamentally people are missing the fact that nature is inherently like the underpinner of having a more stable economy and having jobs and having all of this kind of security. Um, it's also like connected, not that we have to make the argument about how it's connected to affordable housing, but like it is true that like without our natural resources, we have very unstable like socioeconomic systems. And it's really funny, like ironically sad how we see like killer whales everywhere in BC. They're in the airport, their imagery is everywhere.
Images of them.
Exactly. There's statues of them. And yet, like something to really get home how bad it is that BC doesn't have a standalone species at risk legislation is that an emergency order was denied by cabinet. So like Sarah, like the way that I understand it is that the federal government basically said to the provinces and the territories, like, you need to have like a species at risk legislation. It has to either be just as good as this one, if not better. If it's not better, then you use SARA, but there are so many loopholes in SARA, like you mentioned earlier, Sally, in terms of what it doesn't protect in BC. So there was this agreement between BC and the federal government to have a provincial species at risk legislation, which has not happened, which is a problem. And as a result, species are falling through the cracks, and this piecemeal approach is just not adequate to adequately like address critical habitat that needs to be protected, to adequately address species at risk that are falling through the cracks. And so an emergency order was actually put through to protect the southern resident killer whales under the Federal Species at Risk Act. But even that was denied, I think, more than once. And so it's really just showing you like we have this federal law that is supposed to really intervene when we need it the most, when we have so much data showing that this species is going extinct, that they're starving, and that there's all of these other issues like noise pollution and things like that. And that even then, an emergency order is not put through. And it's like, well, why not? So it's just like a very complicated, situation.
Well, and just to jump in there, because I do, and this is something coming from policy background, is interesting, is that we often talk about the need to have not necessarily replications of policy, but at least to have the foundations of policy exist at different levels of government. Because, again, as you say, otherwise it's like the federal government comes in and then the provincial government has no policy precedent. It makes it much easier for somebody to turn around at the provincial level and say, well, actually, let's not do the federal thing. Much less effective because there's no provincial equivalent. There's no action policy at that provincial level. And even at a municipal level, too, it wouldn't necessarily see a municipal species at risk act, but even at a municipal level, too, having some sort of policy foundation for this allows you to then actually have collaboration between different levels of government as opposed to, even if not direct opposition, then a misalignment of policy.
Right. And we see that. And, I think this goes back to the Constitution of Canada, where the decision-making powers over natural resources and the land base are provincial. And yet people think that we are protecting our species at risk because we have a federal law. But then that creates this mismatch that you're talking about. No, actually, the federal law can't, that's not the level of jurisdiction that governs land decisions. That's the province. And so we need to have laws where the decisions get made.
I think it is funny how much environmental impacts can determine the way. So, I'm from Newfoundland, Labrador originally, and we can argue about whose province is prettier later. But there is this kind of understanding of the importance economically on a very fundamental level of the environment, because you had the cod fishery collapse, and that was such a consistent thing. And I know that the economy, the environment is a huge part of the economy of BC as well. So I'm curious if you have, and this is a bit of a tangent question, I'm curious if in the conversations you have with other BC residents, once you sort of like talk about this stuff, do they get it? Or are there sort of obstacles to them making that connection?
Resource extraction has been a huge economic mainstay of the province since the province started. And I do think that people are worried about losing jobs, I know they are losing jobs as forestry returns are declining. But that's to have a sustainable forestry really requires that we ensure that some land base is protected and some land base is going through rotations at the appropriate level to maintain the price of the timber that we're selling. So that we're not selling just cheap second growth that goes into pulp, but have really high quality, older timber. So I think moving towards we need to come up as a province to say how much of our province do we want to have basically as this kind of tree farm, or we're basically deforesting the whole province. And I don't think we want to do 100%. I don't think we want 100% of a tree farm. We really want to have a more balanced approach where some areas, okay, these are going to be in the rotation for forestry, but these whole other areas we want to protect and not have and that needs to be a conversation. What do we do with the jobs? We have to shift towards the jobs that will be maintained by those intact forests. And that includes tourism, that includes wilderness travel, that includes people being able to be engaged in monitoring and ensuring ecosystem health, as well as the wide variety of jobs that come from it. And other countries have done that. Costa Rica made a shift from let's not cut down all our forests. We're going to shift to an ecotourism based society, and that has enabled them to have one of the most resilient and growing economies in their region. So we have alternatives to just cutting down to the last tree.
And ecotourism is already huge in British Columbia. We have to say that as well. And the size of that industry, I think people don't understand how big of an industry that is, especially in a place like British Columbia, but even across Canada and across the world. The number of people that are traveling here, whether it's birders looking for a rare bird or of course, whale watching, is huge. People come from all across Canada and the world to go whale watching in BC, visiting all of the beautiful national parks. We're talking millions and millions of dollars of revenue from ecotourism already. If there's no whales to look at, if there's no birds to look at, if there's no beautiful landscape to look at, that industry is going to disappear. And so it's really important that we make sure, not just for financial reasons, obviously, but if we're going to look at it in that lens, we need to make sure we're doing this sustainably. And with some aspects of ecotourism, I'm not sure we are right now. So kind of just another parallel of what Sally was talking about there.
And there's a reputational risk. If it is more broadly known that British Columbia is not actually protecting endangered species and that these continue to be lost from our province, then people may just decide to boycott coming here because they don't want to come and participate in a jurisdiction that's not protecting the beauty that's around us.
Yeah, I mean, there's that existing impact to ecotourism to begin with. So then when the government isn't, and it could be a very beneficial industry, right? But when your government isn't also doing what it needs to do to protect the outer bounds. You've covered this to a certain extent, but what does protecting biodiversity in BC actually require, from habitat to stronger laws, and what happens if we don't act?
Yeah. Well, we continue to lose. What do we need? We need, for species at risk in general, certainly at the federal level, the habitat needs of those species, and the ways that we need to reduce threats are pretty well known and documented for the ones that are federally listed. There's a lot of species in BC that don't have that kind of documentation about what we need to reverse the trends, but we know them in kind of suites in particular regions. We know what the issues are. So we can do this at a community level. We don't have to go species by species by species. Peter mentioned the Okanagan, our one desert environment. We have rattlesnakes there and tarantulas. It's kind of a crazy sagebrush environment. Well, we know what's needed to protect that environment, and that is to make sure that there's enough area that's protected and that there are corridors between these patches of desert environments. So we can act at provincial level to have a much more kind of logical protected area network where the corridors are protected and where enough of each ecosystem is protected that it can thrive.
I agree with everything Sally says. And I also just want to add, bringing it back into some of these indicators. We talked about the red list, which is sort of the emergency room, very high risk of extinction, and the blue list, which is reserved for species at risk, but not as much as the red listed species, and then the yellow list, which is kind of species that are considered to be secure. We want everything on the yellow list. That should be the standard. That should be what we're shooting for. This sort of action where we're just sort of keeping things where they previously were means that we're failing to meet that goal of getting everything into a place where it's secure. And I think it's important, kind of relating to the idea of shifting baselines, like, oh, southern resident killer whales have always been so rare. Like, we need to strive to make sure that all of these species and populations are secure and off of these, out of the emergency room and in a place where we don't have to be constantly prioritizing and choosing. And it's less of this chaotic state where we have 500 species that are on the brink and all of them desperately need our attention. We can't sustain that. So it's really important to act and to act now.
Maybe let's tell a little story. One of the species or groups of species that we're losing a lot of both in BC and Canada are grassland birds. These are birds that eat insects, and they have been really declining in numbers. And those are those species that are becoming more and more threatened and endangered. So what do we do for them? Well, that requires working together with farmers, working with agricultural partners to ensure that we have either diversified farm systems or hedgerows or other natural environments abutting our agricultural land. So there is space for insects on our farms and our agricultural systems. And that can help the farmers. That does help the farmers. It often improves pollination success if there are these native pollinators in the surrounding area. Birds, of course, can also eat the harmful insects. So we want to maintain bird populations in these areas. So working together and looking for how do we do what we need to do to feed our population, but not by harming native species.
I just want to add first about grassland birds that World Wildlife Fund actually recently released a report on biodiversity. And the most starking kind of statistic was that in Canada grasslands, like across all of the grasslands, that there were declines of 62% in biodiversity, which was the most staggering. And we do have grasslands in British Columbia. We have really sensitive grassland ecosystems in the South Okanagan that are home to over 200 species at risk. And these are actually really important areas. And I think, Connor, to your question of, what do we do? This is why academia was always hilarious for me, because I'm so not like a linear thinker. So I'm going to just share all of my thoughts together. But I think baseline is the local is so incredibly important. I think as humans, we always try to make rules for like mass scale issues or problems, or we really want things to just be one thing and it's definite and it's certain. And we know that because we're so desperate to be sure. But you miss so much nuance. Like Sally, the examples that you were just sharing really make me think how important it is to be in a place to see how the ecosystem works, to see how it's connected to communities, to see how farmers need like healthy lands, and to figure out how they can actually do their work in a way that's not negative or that doesn't cause degradation. And so to have healthy ecosystems as the North Star means spending time in community, means being in a particular place to actually get to know it really well. And that's how you're going to know how to take care of the land. I think also, as a society and also on the individual level, we need to get really clear with what our values are, because I think it's really easy, even just in like a little sense of selfishness, like I don't want to donate something to like this organization because I don't see the impact that it's going to have on the community. Even something as small as that kind of feeling, that multiplied by however many people we have in our province in the world breeds this like environment where we don't see ourselves as part of the public space around us, as part of nature, as part of our communities. And I think that actually has like very like harmful negative impacts, and people need to kind of get clear about what they love and then actually protect what they love. Usually family comes really easy, but start, spending time going for a walk or looking at, your environment around you and realizing like, oh, I kind of do have this like responsibility to place, or I have this responsibility to be here because it's given me so much. And that's like something that I struggle with all the time, is like, how do you actually get people to feel more connected to their community when, like people can be not nice, or just yesterday I got like scammed on the phone by like a banker or whatnot, and it can really make you start to feel fearful and just close down. But that's the opposite of what you should do. I think we've already talked about a species at risk legislation, and also just educating people on the fact that we have all of these gaps in policy. I think something that's really great is to not forget the reconciliation piece, that we have a lot of Indigenous-led conservation initiatives going on across the province. And it's really important to be aware of that and to be in partnership with First Nations, working with them to steward their territory and working with them to, maybe it's like, get land use planning done to figure out, what areas are the best to be protected in terms of what is like a high biodiversity, high ecosystem health area. But sometimes we're like protecting areas that actually don't have high incidences of biodiversity. So it's really about, the critical habitat mapping that's important. And I also think, going back to my long rant about interconnectedness, and to really understand that we are not separate from the world around us, and that our politicians are people too. They have their own issues, they have their own fears and their own worries, and it's about actually trying to heal within yourself, the traumas that you have and the things that keep your heart blocked and the things that keep your heart not open to life. And I think when you can really work on that in yourself, then you're able to better be in communion or to be in relationship with other people. And I think that that will slowly have positive trickle down effect. It's very multifaceted.
Well, no, but Brynna, it's funny because you mentioned that. I think this is something both of our organizations do focus on, is trying to get people out into nature, right? Sierra Club has a huge history of this. The US sister organization we have, obviously a much longer one going back, but that fundamental connection, it's one thing I love about like the wild child programs that we have, is that it's getting kids out in nature, getting that initial connection going, that is really formative later on. Because as you say, if you see nature as part of, I made a really good former podcast. It was actually something Gilbert White Duck said on the podcast, which was, start thinking about things getting better. That ended up being the title of the podcast. And that one was on rights of nature specifically, in that kind of way of thinking about our relationship with nature. But it was very much framed around, again, what if we stopped thinking about just keeping species in the red, just keeping things ticking on, and actually thought about, okay, we're going to give nature some sort of right here. We're going to actually push forward to make the situation better, as opposed to the mentality, as you say, of like decline and isolation that tends to be very pervasive at the moment, unfortunately.
100%. And
I think a lot of times people perceive the biodiversity crisis as somewhere else. Oh, this is a problem in Brazil or in the tropics. It's here. It's around us. And we have to have our eyes open to that. But the good thing about that is that we can act locally, that we can do it. It's hopeful. We need hope, and there's a lot of hope here. We can protect species at risk. We can protect the land where they live. Donate to land trusts. Get out in nature. Take out some of those invasive species planted from Europe and replace them with species that need a little bit of help, that are native species and that need a little bit of help. Take out those medians that just have grass, put in diverse local wildflowers. There's a lot we can do locally, and people do. And I think they get a lot of reward for that. So kudos to probably many of the people listening to this podcast for what you're doing, because that makes a difference, that acting locally.
Thank you. I think we're at our hour mark. I just want to say thank you so much, all of you, for joining me today. Really appreciated it and really enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for having us. It's a wonderful opportunity and really enjoyed the discussion.
Thank you.
yeah, thanks so much, Connor. It was super fun to talk and to learn more about all of this and the importance. Looking forward to it being out.
So after we wrapped up the formal podcast interview here, we had a discussion about the recent announcement by the Alberta government that they were planning to become the proponent for a new oil pipeline to the west coast of BC. This is largely because they could not find a private sector proponent, which I would argue, and we have argued, is the latest sign that the age of oil and gas really is coming to an end, and there isn't private sector interest in a pipeline to BC because there just isn't a business case for one, and it's a bad choice for a national project of interest or major project. And I'll put a link below to our media release concerning the pipeline announcement, and that has some information on the economics that I'm referencing here. The major thing to understand in all this is that global demand for oil and gas is expected to peak this decade and then start to decline, and already there isn't going to be the demand there for a new oil pipeline because we actually have enough oil and gas projects already in development to meet demand as demand declines. So it's not even a good idea as a project from an economic perspective. And a further thing to understand is that this really does come down to the Alberta government potentially wasting a lot of taxpayer money on a pipeline. And I would argue that it's not even to develop a pipeline that they're doing this, that this whole issue of the pipeline is actually cover for trying to erode climate regulations and ultimately trying to allow the oil and gas industry and oil and gas corporations to run away with as much profit as possible while it declines. I mean, we've seen even when production in the oil and gas sector increases, that doesn't mean jobs increase. In fact, they continue to decrease, and there's layoffs because of automation and other factors. And I would argue overall, because the oil and gas industry knows it's going to go into decline. So I would argue this entire issue is actually a bit of a smokescreen to try and provide cover for these companies, to try and sow division that allows them ultimately to make more profit off of Canada, potentially take a lot of public money in the process and run off of it. But I decided to ask what people thought about this, and we got a few responses here. And so here is an additional conversation for today's podcast with the guests about that announcement by the Alberta government that they were planning to be the proponent for a new proposed oil pipeline to the west coast of BC.
And I think a lot of these issues have to do with acting out of concern for the immediate economic impact, and that, we can put off the biodiversity crisis, we can put off the climate change crisis into the future, but those crises are going to affect the economy in the short term as well as the long term. Mm-hmm. We don't have the time anymore for it to be long term. The trade-off is in the near future. It is in the present. Many communities throughout British Columbia are suffering from fire after fire after fire. We're seeing massive changes to the environment due to climate change and warming environments. Fish are moving up to places they've never been seen before. And the Inuit and other northern communities are not having the winter roads or other ice pack that they're used to having over the majority of the winter season. Our world is changing. It's changing faster through climate change in Canada than in other countries because of where we live in the north. These economic short-term impacts, immediate impacts, we can't put off the trade-offs with climate change and the biodiversity. And so, we need to be fostering a green economy now. We need to be fostering not fossil fuel burning, but rather shifting from renewables. We need to have an electronic grid that goes across the country so that we can share electricity and not rely so much on oil and gas products. The kind of investment we need is an infrastructure that electrifies and enables that sustainable use. More solar power. There's a lot of solar energy that is attainable on our built environment without having to destroy our unbuilt environment. Let's do that first.
One thing that comes to mind for me when I hear about these pipelines and other projects, I do some work with underwater noise in the Salish Sea. It's off of southern British Columbia, and there are a whole bunch of these projects coming in, including related to fossil fuels, but also just generally shipping expansions in places like the Roberts Bank and so on. And they, of course, do some sort of environmental consideration, and they often pledge or have some evidence to support that the amount of underwater noise generated by the additional shipping traffic will not exceed previous levels. And indeed, it is quite an extensive effort that they are committing to potentially add new traffic, but still maintain a somewhat similar noise level. And they might do that. But it's the same problem in essence as species in the red list staying on the red list. Because just like the red list is not a place where you should want to be, and we shouldn't be just doing barely enough to keep species alive and on the red list. The amount of underwater noise generated by human vessel activity in the waters off the coast of southern British Columbia it is well documented that it's far too high for southern resident killer whales and many other underwater species that require a quiet environment to survive. So, saying that this a new project or a new development, new pipeline is going to, it's not going to increase noise any further. That shouldn't be the bar that we're going for, because what we need to be doing is decreasing noise. We need to be rapidly doing so, in fact. And that's true no matter what we do, no matter how many new vessels are coming in. And I think it's another situation where we need to collectively make sure our standards are not faltering in that regard. And we're not just kind of keeping things the way they were or maintaining the status quo, because things are already changing in quite bad ways in all over the place.
And if the conversation is either you burn up the environment or we have jobs, and that's the trade-off, then we have to ask, why is that the trade-off? Why are we not diversifying our jobs so that we can protect the environment and have the job base that ensures that everybody has a living wage?
And I really doubt that companies are going to keep to those noise requirements. I agree with you. I think decreasing is there. But I'm literally reading in Business in Vancouver yesterday, the amount of toxic pollution from LNG facilities was massively underestimated. And now a bunch of local residents in BC are actually suffering immediate health impacts right now as a result of that underestimation. So whenever now I hear anybody claim that they are going to keep the pollution of what they have existingly been doing down, I have trouble just believing it.
That's the early indicators with respect to underwater noise as well. Is no, I don't think it's actually it's certainly not getting better, and I'm not even sure it's staying the same.
And tailing ponds and other mitigation measures, we typically do not ensure that the companies have invested enough to deal with the environment problems that are caused. And then that's back on the public. So we end up having to foot the bill for remediation of all of these polluted waters and lands.
Yeah, well, there was a master's student of Rosemary Collard's, I believe, that came out with a paper talking about how many failed unreclaimed or reclaimed mines there were across BC, and just the negligence of these things being left that are still polluting into waterways and destroying habitat. And I think, Peter, I don't know if we all saw Blackfish. I recently saw it, even though I put it off because I just really didn't want to watch it, about killer whales in captivity, and not to always focus on the killer whales. And there are obviously organisms and wildlife in BC of different intellectual levels, but that it was really found out how intelligent these animals are, capable of emotional processing, and they have their own culture and they have their own, traditions amongst their pods, that for them to be experiencing that level of noise pollution completely disrupts their way of life. It's the same thing as basically taking someone's house and just moving them and putting them somewhere completely new with no roof over their heads. They're just out to survive for themselves. And there was this really cool augmented reality exhibition that came to Victoria, where you see these 3D whales and you get to hear the noise pollution, and they even make it much quieter because they don't want to hurt you or anything. But actually experiencing what it could be like really gives you a different perspective of oh my God, how terrible. And they can't control any of this. And I think it's not that humans are inherently evil or bad, but we've found so many ways to bypass being able to empathize or experience what other animals might be experiencing. So it makes it just super easy to continue as normal and business as usual.
Was that the critical distance thing?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah. I have some colleagues that have worked on that, on developing that. It's really striking. Not the time for it, but I could go down a huge rabbit hole about underwater noise and how it's just like people just don't understand how different the physics of noise are and what that means for the way that killer whales and other underwater species are experiencing. It's like being in a crowded nightclub all the time. And you just can't talk, like you have to shout to talk to anyone. And let's not forget that many of these species echolocate to find food so that they can't hear, they can't eat. And so anyway, we don't need to go down that tangent, but it's those sorts of issues where it's really hard to put into perspective how much of an effect we are having in some cases.
Thanks again for the additional chat. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Once again, find out more and take action on environmental issues like these at sierraclub.ca, and hit like and subscribe if you want to hear more content like this.